Dr. Zurita Ona, or Dr. Z, as you're known. Welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. Super excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm glad to have you here. And maybe we can start out by having you tell us something about your past and your training. One thing that I think I recall correctly is you're from Bolivia originally. Is that right?
That's correct. I am originally from Bolivia, South America, and I came to the States in 2001. And my undergrad is in school psychology, and I got a master's on specialized education. And then when I came to the States, I got my doctoral degree in clinical psychology.
Yeah,
And
good.
for the
Good.
past, thank you. It was a lot of work, I can tell you that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I've been through it, so I know. Yeah.
So
What drew you to come to the US?
that's a very interesting story. The short version is that I ended up getting a job as a teacher on a special ed. I was
Uh-huh.
working with children with neurocognitive disorders, Asperger's, high functioning autism, and that's how I got a lot of behavioral training. And later on, and I continue with the doctoral training, and I continue to specialize more on anxiety, OCD, and fear-based struggles. But it was one of those random things that happen in life, right?
Yeah.
The opportunity came out, I applied for a couple of jobs, I got an interview, and then I made it here. And I have been in the States for the last 20 years.
Wow. I guess you like it.
I feel grateful for the education I had. I feel grateful for the opportunities I had.
Yeah.
And for the last couple of years, also, I had been writing, almost a book per year on different topics about anxiety and emotional regulation. So I feel very grateful for the opportunities that I had in this country. There were a lot of work, of course, but
Yeah.
overall, I feel
Sure.
super grateful.
Sure. Do you go back to Bolivia every now and then?
I actually go home every single year.
Oh,
I go
okay.
to spend time with the family. I jump on a plane for sometimes 12, 15 hours. Sometimes I stop in Mexico until, waiting for the plane.
Yeah.
I make the point to go to Bolivia every single year.
Wow. Yeah, that is so far away, 15 hours.
It
Wow.
is. It is. It usually takes me 2 days of traveling, right?
Yeah. Wow.
So
It's yeah, good to break it up.
that's right. That's right. Sometimes my plane does a scale in Mexico or Nueva York, sometimes in Panama, sometimes in Peru, right? So I think I usually plan that. When I'm going back home, I need to plan 2 days for traveling just to be there. Coming back, it's a little bit more straightforward, just 12 hours. But when I'm going down there, there is so many more scales that the plane is going to be making.
Uh-huh. Wow. Wow. So, in the course of your training, you became interested in ACT or uh, accommodation, no, acceptance and commitment therapy. I
Got
don't know
it.
why I block on that. Acceptance and commitment therapy, sometimes called ACT, sometimes called ACT. We may use different expressions here. What, um, how did you become interested in ACT or ACT?
Wow, that's a beautiful question. How much time do you have? How much coffee do you have
Well,
next?
all in all, we'll spend about an hour
Okay.
or less,
So
but not
here's
just on that one question.
thank you. So here's the story. In Bolivia, my program was based on cognitive psychology, and I
Okay.
was doing a lot of behavioral interventions. But I was, of course, training cognitive behavior therapy. I used to spend hours challenging thoughts and looking for the evidence of a thought and evidence against a thought, doing a lot of thought logs and really questioning the accuracy of thinking, right? Whether it's true or false, and how do I want to cope with a thought.
Uh-huh.
And when I say that I was a hardcore behavioralist training CBT, I absolutely mean it. We breathe and we live, right?
Yeah.
CBT. And then when I started a doctoral training, at the end of my first year of training, I hear a little bit about this new approach, a third wave approach called acceptance and commitment therapy. And I kind of like got curious, what is this thing that people are talking about? And everyone that I talk, my mentor, other classmates, they were so excited about it.
Uh-huh.
I got curious, and I went to maybe 5 trainings on a year in Mississippi with one of the founders of acceptance and commitment therapy. And to be honest, at the beginning, I was an outsider. I also was an outlier because I was like, what are you saying? That what we know, it doesn't work? That this idea of challenging thoughts doesn't work too well? How is that possible? What is the research? And it was only on my maybe third workshop that I say, okay, Patricia, just try to stop understanding with your mind and just see how it feels and how it's for you. Just go with exercise.
It's
And
hard
that
to
was
it's hard to learn something new because we hang on so tightly to the stuff that we know already, and it gives us a certain feeling of security, right? And to open our mind, the process that you're describing, I love it because I've gone through that struggle myself. Yeah.
actually no. I think these days I see that what I was doing, I was playing it safe because holding with white knuckles to what I knew was protecting me from something that I didn't know, was
Uh-huh.
protecting me
Yeah.
from uncertainty and ambiguity, right?
Yeah.
But it was really only when I made this conscious decision to, Patricia, stop trying to make sense with all the research you know about this stuff and just see how you feel and how this exercise goes for you. And to be honest, that was the beginning of experiencing something completely different and having the experience inside out of this idea that instead of fighting against a thought, learning to make room for it. That this
Uh-huh.
idea that as human beings, we're going to have all types of thoughts, fun thoughts, hypotheses, dreams, but we also sometimes we have yucky thoughts about who we are as people, how defective we are, or what's going to happen if we say the wrong thing. So, this idea of learning to accept our thoughts was something completely new to me,
Wow.
completely for
Interesting because Stephen Hayes, the founder of this approach, also comes from very much from a behavioral background. He was
that's right.
deeply rooted in all of that, but he breaks off into somewhat of a different direction. There was one word you said that I didn't understand. It sounded to me like yucky thoughts.
Yes. Sometimes I talk about yucky thoughts, right?
How do you
And
spell that? Oh, yucky. Y
yeah,
U C K Y.
yes.
Okay, I got it now. Yucky thoughts.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And what thank you for asking. And what I am referring to that is that as long as we are alive, we are going to have a thought that doesn't feel right, that doesn't feel good. The example of that could be stories we have about ourselves, stories about being defective, stories about being too messed up. And in old models, what we used to do was challenging that thought.
Yes.
You have a negative thought about yourself, you have to quickly actually list down all the positive things about yourself, right?
Yeah. Right.
In the past, those interventions work, and again, I practice them up and down.
Yeah.
But the challenge is that we are never going to win against our mind because our mind is a content generating machine. It's constantly coming up with a lot of thoughts, blah, blah, blah,
Right.
yap, cha,
Right.
cha. So, as long as we're breathing, we are going to have hundreds of thoughts of all types of qualities. But what is important is to let to make room for them and check, how do I want to respond to this thought? Do I have to respond to the thought? Do I have to listen to this thought?
Hmm.
So that was the beginning, and it's one of the core interventions within acceptance and commitment therapy. And over the last 17 years, I have been practicing breathing and living. And all that I can say today is that it has completely shifted my clinical work and my personal life. my capacities to relate to my own struggles also are completely influenced by the principles from acceptance and commitment therapy.
Okay, well, I hope as we go along, you'll say more about that and give us personal examples to the extent that you're comfortable.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
I can respond to that. Speaking about stories, for example, when I came to this country, one of the thoughts that started emerging in my mind was that I was a bad daughter because I left my family in Bolivia.
A
And
bad
and that
daughter.
thought,
Yeah.
right, came with a lot of, I think, embarrassment, sometimes shame, sometimes guilt, sometimes with anxiety.
Yes.
And what I used to do, I used to just make sure I'm calling the family, I'm texting the family all the time, right? But it was coming not with a sense of connection, but it was coming from a sense of fear, fear
Uh-huh.
about what I did,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So when I start learning to make room to this thought, even though it's a painful thought, I realized that I don't have to act on it all the time as a way to repair the decision I made. I
Hmm.
don't have to act from a place of shame of, sometimes disconnecting or hiding or thinking that, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, I'm this awful person because I am here and the family is down there, right?
Yeah. Right.
So I learned to notice the thought. I learned to say, here comes the thought that I'm not good enough. I'm not
I
a good
know that
enough.
thought. Here it comes.
Here it comes, right? I can see it coming.
Right.
I sometimes visualize the thought. And then I check in this moment when I'm writing, in this moment when I'm having a conversation with David, in
Yeah.
this moment when I'm watching a movie. Do I have to respond to this thought? Do I have to frantically text my family to make sure they know I love them? Most of the times, the answer has been no. And what has happened with that is that by learning to make room to that thought that I'm not good enough, I have learned to actually have so much more energy to connect with my family in a more authentic way, in a way that it's not driven by fear, but by pure connection.
Yeah.
So that's a tiny example about how when we quickly respond and automatically respond to our thoughts, it may look like it's working, but the
Yeah.
question is, what is the master that we're serving to, right? What is that really, really helping me? Versus learning to intentionally decide how to respond to thinking. It can liberate us from many of these traps.
Yeah. It's interesting that what's common to both approaches is noticing, is being
Yeah,
aware of the thoughts. Both involve that, but the earlier one was with resistance, and and the later one is with quotes acceptance, which is part of the
yeah.
name.
That's right. So within acceptance and commitment therapy, there are basically six core processes and that we invite people to practice and to relate to. One of them is diffusion, which is this capacity and this skill to watch your thoughts, notice them, naming them, and see how you want to respond to them. There are the other ones, acceptance, which is making room, leaning towards, and approaching any uncomfortable internal experience you're having,
Yeah.
like any feeling, any sensation. There is this other process that we call it self as a context, and it's this capacity to step back and notice that you are not defined by your thoughts, feelings, or sensations, but you are a container. There is also this other process, contact with the present moment, which is mindfulness, is being here right now. And then there is the values component when we invite people to figure out what's truly important to you in your heart, what really matters, what do you want this life to be about. And there is the committed action, which is learning to take all the steps to approach the stuff that matters with me. Now, what is also very unique is that doing the stuff that is important for us is not flowers and butterflies only. It comes with sometimes a lot of work and sometimes with fears and comes with anxieties.
Yeah.
So with ACT, we invite you to make room for those yucky experiences that they also may come, for all those things that those fears, worries, anxieties, obsessions, in the service of taking steps towards what matters.
Wow. You really have internalized all of this information really well. And so, how do you know a lot of your work involves working with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder? And so, how did you come to specialize in working with that particular disorder?
That's a great question. And I think one is that I was born in the midst of a dictatorship in my country. My country had a dictatorship from 1970 to 1978, and we do have a history of military regiments. So at the time when I was born, I have some of these memories as a kid in which I saw how fear can shape people. There was exchange of political prisoners. There was restriction of food. Sometimes there was regulations that after 6 o'clock, you can only be walking on the street until 8 p.m. only with two or three people. If there were any groups more than three people, people will be arrested. So very early, I have these experiences about how fear shapes people's behaviors.
Yeah,
And later on, also, I learned how within my family, sometimes there were messages about playing it safe, about doing things that we know, right? So we should approach that. I
yeah,
am coming from a working class family. So I think working hard is another way in which you play it safe, right?
yeah.
Um, like if you have to choose between a career, if you have to choose between an artistic career versus going to law school or medicine, right? Of course, you have to choose that law school or medicine, because the other one is unknown and it's not very solid, right? So I think
Like
in a lot
psychology.
of exactly, when I
Yeah,
told my family I wanted to be a psychologist, it was, Patricia, how is that possible? What are you going to do? You won't have a job, you won't make it.
oh,
The first reactions was like that. It really
right.
took my family a couple of years to realize that she will be okay. She
Yeah,
will just make it happen.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
so I think in a more cultural context, one of the variables that led me to be interested in fear-based struggles was my own upbringing. The time in which I was born, being exposed to military regiments, how I saw that shaped my family. And later on, I think I navigated life and I continue to navigate life with a collection of fears, And so having always fascinated and touched by any fear-based struggle that we experience as human beings, whether we
yeah,
call that obsessive compulsive disorder or panic attack or chronic worry or specific phobias, all of those are fear-based reactions. And it just happens that sometimes we, even though we do our best, we don't handle them effectively. So my
you,
interest.
uh,
Mhm.
yeah. I've got six grandchildren. Okay, and I'm thinking about this situation in this country where
Yeah,
they're growing up in a very fear-based environment in some ways. I mean, there's the COVID fear.
yeah.
They can't go to school. It's all homeschooling. They're not getting the socialization, etc. I think there's going to be a big need for the kind of therapy that you're talking about for this
Yeah,
generation.
yeah, exactly. I think we all are going to be shaped by all what is happening.
Yeah,
It's a very extraordinary time, and it's a time in which we are experiencing firsthand what means living in fear.
yeah,
And certainly is adaptive. We're doing things that are very adaptive responses because of fear. We are washing our hands, we're using masks, we're keeping social distancing. But other times also fear can make us be checking hundreds of times what are the stats of COVID, right? Can actually make us watch every single new or research for all types of treatments to make sure you don't get COVID.
yeah,
So as fear can drive very adaptive responses, it also can keep us stuck. And
yeah.
OCD is one of those forms in which we can get stuck, right? So I
Right.
think my work has evolved. I was very fortunate that during grad school, my mentor was very interesting on emotion regulation, which is how you relate to all types of emotions. How do you handle overwhelming emotions?
Yes.
And my first books were actually focused on that emotion regulation. But it gave me a nice lens to zoom in so much more into fear-based struggles. As you will see, my work has been progressing, and with OCD in particular, one of the things that happens is that OCD is extremely debilitating condition. And for most people dealing with panic attack or with social anxiety or with chronic worry, they usually receive therapy between 1 to 2 years. From the moment they are searching for therapy until the time they are receiving services is 1 to 2 years. With OCD, it takes an average of 8 to 12 years.
Wow.
Uh,
I
that is
was,
a large number of time in which people are deeply suffering. And when I say deeply suffering, I absolutely mean it, because I witnessed firsthand how it's for my clients to wrestle with a sticky thought that they cannot let it go. If they could, they will have done it. But it's a
sure.
thought that if like you have put your fingers inside an outlet, your whole body is on edge, your whole body is shocked, and you cannot move on with your day. So I think that's one of the sad realities when we think about OCD. And I think the other aspect to that is that we know that exposure based interventions are the golden standard for treating any form of anxiety struggles. We know they work, we know they are extremely effective, and yet something that we also have been learning is that an average of 24% of clients, they don't experience a reduction in their symptoms, which means they're still stuck with obsessions and compulsions.
Yeah,
On top of
I missed a word there. They don't experience what?
a reduction of their symptoms, it
Ah,
means
a
even
reduction. Yeah.
yeah, it means that even though when people go to treatment,
Yeah.
24% of those clients they won't get better.
Okay. And you just sort of mentioned something that I noticed in some material that you sent me that I wasn't used to that phrase. It was new for me. Exposure response prevention, which you abbreviate as ERP, and that seems to have play a big role in your work now. So, what's the relationship between ACT and ERP, if any?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, just to step back a little bit, when we think about exposure and we refer to it as exposure response prevention, is an intervention in which we teach clients to approach their fears. It's really to get closer to any situation, any activity, any person they are avoiding, and it's affecting their life. So, exposure or ERP has been the frontline treatment for the last 4 years, maybe longer than that, right? So, we know it
For the
works.
last how many years?
For maybe 30 or 40 years.
30 or 40 years. It's kind of there in the very beginning of behavioral therapy, I think, right? And
Right.
people to get over phobias in particular, I think was one of the first test areas. And so the person is who suffers from being afraid of some specific thing, like going over a bridge,
Yes.
to do it in small successive approximations, and there's this, and at some point I think it was a mental approach, right, to imagine, and even imagining would arouse anxiety. More tougher cases, I think they found it was better to take a person into the real world with a
Yeah.
real bridge and practice getting calming
Yeah.
themselves in small
Yeah.
steps going over the bridge.
Yeah, you summarized it beautifully, David, right? It's really exposure is this successive approximation. It's getting close to what you are afraid of. Can be the bridge, can be an elevator, can be a spider, can be a snake, can be a school. In the case of OCD, can be fears of contamination, can be fears of harming someone or attacking someone, can be fears about people stealing your knowledge, right? Can
Yeah.
be sexual images. And there are different ways in which you help people to face these fears. One is doing what we call situational exposure, when you go to exactly to the real situation, like you
Yeah.
take an elevator, you drive over the freeway, you hold a knife, right? And sometimes we use imaginal exposure, which is writing a script when we're going to describe exactly what is your core fear, what do you think is going to happen if you drive over the freeway, if you have a knife next to your babies, right? If you have aggressive obsessions. Or sometimes we do exposures using our body. We help people to experience all those physical reactions that they experience when they are scared. For example, it can be your heart beating fast, can be
Yeah.
experiencing a warm sensation in your body. So all of that to say that for the last, since the 50s 60s, has
Yeah.
been the most effective treatment, and it has helped many people,
Okay.
many people.
There's something that confuses me here because the term is exposure response prevention. Now, before, when you were talking about, dealing with your thoughts, you found that it was bad to try to prevent them, and that what
Mhm.
you did was learn to accept them. So you see the conflict that I'm having here, that this talks about prevention rather than response, exposure response acceptance. Help
Yeah,
me
yeah,
out.
yeah. That's a great call. I love it. So when we think about response prevention in the context of exposure, was about reducing any type of safety crutch a person was using. For example, if I have an fears of public speaking, one safety crutch could be that I will always have something to drink next to me. So when I'm getting anxious, I'm just quickly drinking, right? Or
Yeah.
I will always have my cell phone with me. So if I'm a social gathering, right, and I'm very anxious, I pretend to be busy on the cell phone, right? So the response prevention is decreasing those responses so I can actually fully experience my anxiety in a scary situation. Now, what I was sharing in terms of the acceptance piece is, I think, in some way related on the sense that we still teach people to reduce the safety crutches, but what we also teach them a lot is to make room for that fear-based response they're having without fighting it too much. So I think with ACT, we have augmented a lot the acceptance piece. Exposure is certainly has some elements of accepting, but it wasn't fully evolved, or it wasn't fully explained or thought in the way that acceptance and commitment therapy does it,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
Um, I think the premise of both of them is the same. Whenever you are scared and that fear is affecting your life, you approach. But how you're going to do it and why you do it is different. In the exposure model, in the traditional model, you approach your fears because your therapy tells you, because a workbook tells you, and you hope that your anxiety will go down. In the acceptance and commitment therapy model, we do help you and we do invite you to face your fears because it matters to you. The question will be, if you drive over the freeway and you know that your heart may start beating fast, you know that you may hyperventilate, in what way that's going to be helpful for you to be the person you want to be? In which way that's going to help you to show up to your relationships in the way you want it to do? So the question is always, why in the world I'm doing something so uncomfortable like facing my fears,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so invite people to focus on that. And when they are facing their fears, instead of powering through them and just getting through it, we actually invite them to notice how it feels. Where do you notice anxiety in your body?
Yes.
What's the sensation showing up? What type of blah, blah, blah your mind is doing? What is your mind telling you right now? And then we ask people, we teach them skills, and we ask them also, how do you want to respond to that thought? What happens in your life when you go along with those sensations? Does your life get richer and meaningful, or does your life shrink?
Yeah.
So I think both treatments work certainly, right? But the why you do the exposures and the how you do the exposures are quite different.
Hmm. So it seems like somehow one develops a dual focus of not only being aware of the thoughts and the yucky thoughts and so on, but also being aware of your body, of your inner, of your guts. You know, to see what are the sensations that go along with this, and can I relax into it?
Yeah, I think that is definitely one frame to hold this. I think the other thing that to me, given that I have been training both models and I do exposures and help my clients to get unstuck every single day,
Huh.
one of the biggest difference I can say is that facing our fears is hard work. It's not easy. Getting out of our comfort zone, it's extremely uncomfortable and
Oh,
painful sometimes.
yeah.
But I think within acceptance and commitment therapy, the way that I think of it is exposure is a mean towards a values based living. And when you learn to when you learn to experience fear as part of life, when you experience fear as part of your existence as a human being, you not only will be able to overcome this episode of OCD or this phobia, is that you actually learn to face fear as it comes in your life, as you move forward in life, right?
Yeah.
So the impact of learning to relate to our fears, worries, and anxieties is quite different within ACT.
Okay.
How do you see it?
Let's see here. Is uh, ACT is a behavioral and mindfulness based approach. Why do we need exposure then as part of working with OCD? Wouldn't mindfulness be sufficient?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes I think mindfulness is an overall capacity to step back and watch our thoughts and watch our
Mhm.
thinking. But I think exposure is necessary because we still have to target specific fears, specific fears of aggressive obsessions,
Yeah.
specific fears of taking an elevator. So I think mindfulness can be certainly a great addition to the work, but it needs to come with some targeted approach to that fear, right? So I think that is why, even though acceptance and commitment therapy certainly blends mindfulness and behaviorism, we still have to do something a little bit more targeted towards that
Mhm.
particular fear.
Yeah. Yeah. I got that. So, how might the tools that we've been discussing here be applied to the current multiple crises that folks are dealing with? You know, we've got here where you and I live in Northern California, we've got fires and smoke that's not healthy to breathe. We've
Mhm.
got a very difficult political situation around the election and everything. We've got
Right.
COVID. We've got the physical separation, that we're all experiencing, and threats to the planet uh,
Yeah.
in terms of the environment. That's a lot to deal with. How can, in terms of maybe somebody can't afford to go to therapy, are there ways that these things that you're talking about can be used in a self therapy way to help people get through it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly, we are exposed to multiple stressors. This has
Yeah,
been a year in which there has been one stressor after another one. We're recovering from one, and then comes the next, and comes
yeah,
the next. Um, One of the things that happens is that, one, I think it's important to normalize that we are scared, that we are anxious, that doesn't mean that something is broken with us. But I think acknowledging the emotional state we're experiencing from moment to moment, from
Yeah.
day to day, from
Yeah.
hour to hour, right?
Right.
Acknowledging that we may go through our own emotional roller coaster sometimes,
Right.
right? So
Right.
I think given the circumstances, it's a natural thing that we're going to feel a little bit again, like our emotions are shifting, maybe faster than before, that we are maybe more irritated, that maybe we are more scared. So it's, I think, acknowledging the emotional state without judging it, without criticizing it, and without trying to fix it right away.
Yeah.
I think when we experience overwhelming emotions, one of the most common response is to try to solve it and get rid of that, right?
Right.
It's natural. We don't like to be in discomfort. So of course we're going to do all types of things. The challenge is that the problem solving of emotions doesn't help us many times because they may prolong the emotions so much longer. For example, one of the things that has been happening this year is that we also have here that there are more rates of people drinking, or there are more rates of people disconnecting to the point they're experiencing depression. So I think what is important to think is that acknowledging the emotional state where we are is a super powerful skill that will bring us back to the present. When we get scared, our mind will tell us quickly what's going to go wrong, right? For example,
Yeah.
we won't be able to make it, everyone is going to be sick, the earth is going to be fully destroyed, the elections are going to be fraudulent, nothing is going to change with human rights. Or the mind may take us into the past. I want to go back to my normal life. I want my normal. I want to go to my office. I want to go to school, right?
Right.
So when we experience overwhelming emotions, we can sometimes try to use quick fixes, or we actually trying to solve by anticipating how it's going to be in the future, or we keep track of how it was in the past. But none of that take us back into the moment, being present in this moment. So I think that is important these days that we take a deep breath and we actually ground ourselves, and we can ground ourselves with our body. Sometimes we can press our feet really hard to notice the sensation in the legs. Sometimes we may roll our shoulders back. Sometimes we may balance our body. We may readjust our posture in the chair we're sitting down, but we can use our body wherever we are to ground ourselves again in this moment. We can describe things that we see, like I see a lamp, I see a bookshelf. We can describe things that we
Mhm.
hear. I hear the sound of my voice, I hear David's voice. We can describe smells. Why this is important? Because the mind may go quickly into take you what's going to go wrong, or I want the best.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and those reactions actually prolong our emotional state. They prolong our mini roller coaster that we're going through. So that's why bringing ourselves back into the present is super important.
Hmm.
And once we ground ourselves in the present, we may ask ourselves, how do I want to show up to this moment? What's important to me right now? How do I
Hmm.
want to show up to the person that is in front of me? And sometimes, how do I want to show up to my own distress, to my own fear? What's the one thing I can do to make it more manageable without making it worse? So I think those tips are going to be helpful right now as things continue to unfold and we don't know what's going to be the final outcome.
Right. Are there other sort of positive things that people can do? For example, I used to go to the gym, but now I can't go to the gym.
Right.
The gym has gone bankrupt. Not only can I not go, but it's that business is gone. I used to ride my bike, but the air is not good for that, so I can't do that. Um, but there are things maybe that we can do. What are you doing in your life? Doing, and do you have hobbies or activities or gardening, or what are you doing?
That's a great question, David, because I think one of the things that we all have been faced is how to adapt to the reality that we cannot do the things that we could do before. Like you, I cannot go to the gym. Some days I can ride a bike, some days I cannot,
Yeah.
because I will start having reactions. So I will start coughing or my eyes get very itchy. Um, we cannot hang out with people. So I think while all that is happening, one of the things that is also going to be helpful is to adapt and do what's doable. What do I mean by that? I mean that sometimes we may have to think outside of the box and capitalize every single moment we can. For example, one of the things I have been doing is I schedule Zoom calls with friends, whether that's at the end of the day or on the weekends. And naturally, I don't want to be in front of the screen every single hour. But
Right.
right now, it's one of the ways that allow me to connect with others, that allows me to actually have a laugh, have a conversation, and hear how people are doing. It's not ideal, yes, but right now, that's an adaptive response, right?
Right.
Um, or sometimes, right, I think there is a lot of studies showing how gratitude and how self-compassion actually can help us to handle the moment. And
Yeah.
that makes total sense, because all those eh, skills, they actually send a soothing message to the brain, so
Hmm.
the brain doesn't go too much into this agitated place, right? So the question I have for your audience, and I ask myself this sometimes every day, is what's the one thing I can do today that is soothing for my brain? And soothing can be different for each person. Soothing in this context could be watering the plants. Soothing in this context could be watching an old film. Soothing in this context could be reading one of my favorite books, or sometimes cooking one of my favorite dishes, right? Or sometimes spending time with my cat, or listening to music. So I think asking ourselves what's the thing that can help my brain to just step back a little bit so I can navigate through this moment without making it worse, and acknowledging that it's going to be shifting,
Nice.
right?
Yeah. Nicely said.
Like, yeah, so I think the flexibility of how we adapt right now, it's fundamental.
Yeah. And I think it's just helpful to have you reminding us, you know, we know these things, but we can easily forget them. We can get swallowed up by the fear or being in the future, being in the past, and forget that there are a wide variety of skills that would be soothing, and they may vary from person to person.
And from moment to moment, right? So I
Yeah.
think sometimes one of the responses I get is that, well, I did that yesterday and it was really hard, it doesn't work. Here's something important. When we are practicing some of these responses, more soothing responses to help our brain to ground, it's not to make the emotion go away, but it's to navigate through the emotional state without making it worse.
Mm.
Because what will make it worse is ruminating the past, ruminating the future. All the mind noise actually keep us stuck, right? But when I do these, small things that I could do, they may sound very simple. However, they are extremely impactful responses in our well-being in a moment of all types of stressors.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anything else before we close?
That's a great question. Well, of course, I want to say thank you so much again for having a chance to chat with me. And I think I just want to remind the audience that we have it within us to overcome any painful and stressful and overwhelming moment we go through. And as much as when we look at the news and when we hear things, everything feels wrong, there is also amazing things happening. There is also a lot of connection that has been happening,
Yeah.
a lot of gratitude feelings that we have been feeling for people going out of their way to keep communities alive. So I think we have to try to keep things in perspective and hold the whole experience as a
Yeah.
whole.
Yeah.
that teenagers, the kids are showing us how rebellious they are and how much they are fighting for the environment. There are people sometimes um, doing all these global comedies or global shows. They are playing music, the musicians are kicking in, the artists are doing something. So I think we all are doing our best, and sometimes it's easy to focus just in what's wrong. But we can step back and just hold all the other experiences, that is also important.
Yes. Well, that's a wonderful message for us to close on. So, Dr. Zurita Ona, Dr. Z, thanks for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to chat with you again.